Our problems are big. Our climate is collapsing. Our population is growing. Our resources are diminishing. We can't do anything about that, can we? I know we can. I know we can if we take small steps. I know we can if we take small steps to save the world. We're constantly asking our young people to think big, to reach for the stars, to dream big, to shoot for the moon. We're always on the lookout for the next Nelson Mandela or Greta Thunberg. Our problems are big, so we need big people to come up with big answers. We need you to find a cure for cancer. We need you to find a way to feed the whole world. We need you to find a way to spread our resources more equally. On top of that, we need to eradicate child poverty and provide free and good education for our young. Our problems are big. However, those of us who are not Nelson Mandela, what can we do? Nothing? I don't think so. I think we can all take small steps. We can all take small steps to help change our world. How do I know this? I know this because my parents took small steps all of their life. I was born in 1966. Might surprise some of you, but I did come on the stage without aid. I was born in Britain, but my parents were living in Africa at the time. My father was a geography teacher at the foot of Mount Kenya. They were a very ordinary couple from rural Cambridgeshire. At this time, there were fears in the world of a population explosion. So my parents decided to make small steps to do their bit to help see off this problem. Their first small step was that they decided to become a vegetarian. They changed their diet overnight. They felt it was morally wrong of them to eat meat that was raised on the crops grown by farmers who could barely afford to feed their own families. Over 50 years later, they are still vegetarians. Their next small step was to have a more profound effect on me than they could ever have imagined. Like all young couples, they'd always dreamt of having a large family. They had me. They didn't want me to grow up on my own. They wanted me to have siblings. So they decided to adopt. I remember vividly, I was about 2 years old, and it's one of my earliest memories, going to what I thought was the baby shop. We were in the baby shop, and the lady came round from behind the counter with a bag, and in the bag lay a little brown baby. She handed the bag to my parents, and my parents left the baby shop with my brother, John. John was born to an unmarried Indian couple who had to give him up for adoptancy. For many years, I thought this is where all babies came from. I think it was until I was about 18 that I realized this was not the case. A few years later, Jill and Joe decided to take their next small step. They decided to adopt again. By this stage, I was 4, and I remember this even more clearly. We went to an orphanage in Nairobi. The orphanage was made up of one building, a concrete floor, tin roof that was creaking and pinging in the equatorial heat. Along the walls were rows of wooden cots. Each cot had a mattress with a tightly pulled white sheet over it. And on each mattress lay a small brown baby in a white nappy. I ran up and down the aisle, shouting to anyone who was listening, "Well, take this one, and this one." The director of the orphanage asked my parents who they would like to adopt. They said, of course, the one in greatest need. So Peter joined our family. Jill and Joe now had a truly multicultural family. They decided to leave Kenya and go and live in Papua New Guinea. Joe was still teaching at this stage, this time on the fringe of an equatorial rainforest. We spent the next 2 years as boys running up and down the dirt roads, playing toad tag. For those of you who don't know about toad tag, it's when you throw live toads at each other. If you're hit by one, you're it. Avoiding the deadly snakes and spiders that lived in the hedgerows. In the dry season, we would attend sing-sings, where the tribes would come down from the hills and perform their songs and dances for each other. This was an equally magical and terrifying time of our life. After a couple of years in Papua New Guinea, Jill and Joe decided it was time to return to Britain. Rural Britain, 1970s Britain. After the colour and the excitement of Kenya and Papua New Guinea, Britain was monochrome. It was cold. We suddenly had our differences pointed out by everybody. And we had big differences. Racism was never far from the surface. It was at this time that Jill and Joe found the book. The book was published in 1973, called Self-Sufficiency by John and Sally Seymour. The Seymours are environmentalists. Jill and Joe loved them instantly. We were already living without a car, without a television, without a telephone. We already had the world's worst solar panel on our roof. But Jill and Joe thought they would embrace self-sufficiency. So they dug up our garden. We lost our football pitch overnight. They bought chickens. They bought a goat. Jenny the goat. This turned us from being oddities in the village to complete wackos. And everybody, at every opportunity, pointed this out to us. We would spend our weekends foraging in hedgerows or farmers' fields, collecting food for Jenny the goat. Joe would often warn us, "Not too many Brussels sprouts, boys. We don't want the milk tasting of Brussels sprouts, do we?" We certainly didn't. This was the good old days, when teachers could smoke in the staff room. At the end of each week, Joe would collect up the cigarette butts from the ashtrays and bring them home in a bag, and would spend the weekend boiling them on our cooker. "This will sort the green flies out," he would say. It certainly did. It also sorted me out. I've never smoked since then. One Christmas, Jenny the goat came on heat. Now, Jenny was vital for our existence. She provided all our milk, our cheese, our yogurt. So we were prepared for Jenny to come into heat. And we'd already arranged with the local farmer to take Jenny to his billy. It happened to be Christmas Day. So after our lunch of nut roast and Brussels sprouts, the five of us put our coats and boots on and took Jenny 2 miles by foot to the nearest farm. You can imagine people's reactions as we walked across the playing fields with an on-heat goat. 5 of us could only just keep her under control. Everyone else was walking off their turkey lunches and playing with their new Christmas toys, and there were the humans taking their goat to be mated. Fortunately for us, the return journey was under the cover of darkness, so no one saw us return. As you can imagine, as a teenager, I found much of our life excruciating. I wanted to be the same as everyone else. I didn't want to be seen taking our goat across a field. I wanted a car. I didn't want to cycle everywhere. I wanted a telephone. I didn't want to go up to the telephone box. I wanted to eat meat. I wanted to wear my own clothes. Why isn't everyone else doing this, we would say? Everyone should be doing this, was the reply. We should all be doing things to lessen our impact on the world. But we knew that they weren't. When we went round to our friends' houses, we could see the fitted carpets, the plate warmers, the TVs. We couldn't take our eyes off the TVs. But why us, we would say? Why do we have to do this when no one else is? Back came the reply. Just because others aren't doing it doesn't mean that you shouldn't. And I remember Joe saying to us, if it feels right, don't be afraid to be different. This was really hard for a 14-year-old brain to understand. This was the early 80s now, and Joe decided to leave teaching. He wanted to take more small steps, and he joined Oxfam, an NGO based in Britain. I remember sitting down with him and Jill at the time, and they would say to us, we are going to have less money in the family. It didn't seem to make much difference. we were still not eating meat. We still didn't have a car. We still didn't have a TV. But Jill had found jumble sales. Every weekend, we would head down to the local village hall where the guides or the scouts were selling second-hand clothes. Jill's eye for a bargain and sharp elbows made sure we were dressed in the finest clothes that no one else in the village wanted. The following Monday, I would turn up at school in a patched jacket and scuffed shoes that had belonged to my neighbour the week before. When they weren't attending jumble sales, they were running their own. They were raising money, thousands of pounds, for victims of wars and famines at that time. The week before the jumble sale, people would arrive at our house with bags full of clothes, shoes, and toys. Our living room would be full of these bags. The weekend of the jumble sale, we'd have to transport these bags to the village hall on our go-karts and with our wheelbarrow. Neighbours would come round with their cars and load their cars up. But this was still not enough for Joe and Jill. In 1984, there was a famine in the Horn of Africa. It's become a very well-known famine. Oxfam asked Joe if he would go and run 2 feeding camps in Ethiopia at this time. He flew out and tried to keep people fed and healthy in the jaws of a really savage drought. The impact on Joe was profound. And when he turned to Britain, he did struggle for a while. However, a deep bond had formed with him and Ethiopia and the people of Ethiopia. 20 years later, Jill and Joe, working with the Fair Trade Organization, decided to establish a relationship with a small village in the middle of rural Ethiopia. They invited farmers from the village back to Britain in order to meet the cafe owners and the coffee roasters that used their coffee plants. They even raised the money to start a bank in the village that allowed the villagers and the farmers access to credit. An interesting thing happened at this time. For a couple who had spent their life swimming against the tide, suddenly the establishment approached them and asked Joe if he would accept an MBE for his work with Oxfam and the Fair Trade Foundation. He accepted, and I think he's very glad that he accepted. We can't all be like my parents. We can't all want to be vegetarians, to wear old clothes, to dig up our gardens. But I think we can all make small steps. I know small steps can change the world. So what small step are you going to take today? Thank you.